So, what is inflation precisely, and how is it calculated? Is it always a bad thing, or may a small bit of it be justified? We've put up this quick beginner's guide to give you a quick overview of the subject. What is inflation anyway? There are several perspectives on inflation. However, the most basic definition of inflation, as most people understand it, is a rise in the general level of prices for goods and services purchased by households. Overall is the essential term here. Every day, most people purchase a diverse range of goods and services, which fluctuate in price by varying amounts. Some of these items, such as food and power, have more noticeable price swings than others. Furthermore, people do not buy the same things. A teenager's shopping basket will be significantly different from that of an elderly. As a result, any price adjustment will affect different groups of individuals in different ways. It's clear that there's some area for disagreement on how inflation should be calculated. The Office for National Statistics, however, creates an index based on a basket of products and services purchased by the average person in order to provide a broad notion of how the cost of living is changing. A vast number of pricing and spending surveys are conducted, and the baskets are constantly updated to ensure that the index reflects what people are actually buying and that price fluctuations are accurate. The Consumer Prices Index, CPI, and the Older Retail Prices Index are the two key indexes in the United Kingdom, RPI. In most other nations, a CPI-style calculation is used, also called the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices in the EU. Inflation, the difference between RPI and CPI. The RPI includes housing costs via mortgage payments, whereas the CPI does not. This means that RPI inflation is frequently higher than CPI inflation, but not always. While detractors say that the CPI understates inflation by excluding housing prices, proponents argue that housing is an asset, not a good, and hence should not be included. They also claim that, because many mortgages have a variable rate of interest, boosting the interest rate to cool the economy and keep inflation down would actually raise inflation by increasing the monthly mortgage payment, which is factored into RPI. The two methods use slightly different formulas to calculate them. The RPI is calculated geometrically, whereas the CPI is calculated arithmetically. When prices rise, the latter methodology takes into consideration the potential for consumer behavior to shift. As it does in other nations, this should have a minor impact. The gap is significantly bigger, though, due to oddities in the way clothes and footwear pricing are computed. Indeed, the two categories account for approximately 2/3 of the difference between the CPI and the RPI, according to analysts. As a result of this discrepancy, governments have become increasingly interested in using CPI to update tax and benefit payments. Cynics claim that this and other reforms to the way the CPI is calculated in the United States are nothing more than a smokescreen for pension cuts and tax hikes. Other problems with measuring inflation. There are a few small difficulties with inflation metrics as well. For example, some experts claim that the price of electricity and food is so variable that include them in the basket is pointless. The core CPI is the name given to the resulting index. Others argue that excluding large expenditures from price estimates, regardless matter how volatile they are, makes little sense. Another point of contention is how to accurately monitor changes in product quality over time. For example, £1,000 this year will get you a significantly better laptop than £1,000 a decade ago. While most individuals agree that certain modifications are required to account for the increase in quality, some believe that the methods used, known as hedonic adjustment, are excessive. Finally, several countries, most notably China and Argentina, have been accused of lying about inflation. Argentina, for example, has practically prohibited the compilation of independent statistics. Real versus nominal prices. We talk about values in real and nominal terms because of inflation. Real numbers are inflation adjusted, whereas nominal values, raw data, are not. It's crucial to distinguish between the two, especially because some data are expressed primarily in nominal terms while others are expressed in real terms. Economic growth is usually often expressed in terms of real gross domestic product, GDP. Investment returns, on the other hand, are frequently expressed in nominal terms, particularly in the short to medium term, especially in adverts. The real rate must be taken into consideration. In real terms, if you have a savings account with a 0.5% interest rate and the yearly inflation rate is 2% in both RPI and CPI measures, your interest rate is negative. You're practically paying to deposit your money into a savings account. Let's say you put your money in a 0.5% savings account. It means that after factoring in inflation, the value of your money is actually decreasing year after year. This is why Milton Friedman, an economist, claimed that unanticipated inflation was essentially a tax on saving. Of course, on the other hand, inflation might be beneficial to borrowers. It lowers the real interest rate they must pay and may result in a decrease in the value of their loan in real terms, although this is unlikely if their earnings do not keep up with inflation. What causes inflation, and when does IT become a problem? 1. Demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is one of the most common causes of inflation. This occurs when a government or central bank increases the money supply to stimulate the economy. In most cases, the money supply is increased indirectly by lowering interest rates and giving money to banks in the hopes that they will expand credit. Central banks, on the other hand, have the ability to generate money, which may subsequently be used to buy assets in a much more direct manner. In either case, more money is chasing the same number of commodities, resulting in more demand and higher pricing. Firms will respond by increasing output because there is more demand for their products, thus they will produce more. As a result, growth and employment increase. Companies, on the other hand, catch up by rising prices, and workers demand higher wages. As a result, the economy recovers to its original output level, albeit with increased inflation. And if both employers and employees are concerned that inflation will spiral out of control, they may find themselves trapped in a vicious circle known as a wage-price spiral. Workers want greater wages in order to keep up with rising prices, which causes businesses to raise prices in order to stay up with rising wages. As the situation worsens, any savers who haven't already been wiped out seek to move their money elsewhere, stash it in real assets like gold, or just exchange it for products as rapidly as possible. This could make it difficult for enterprises to raise capital. Hyperinflation can reach extremes, causing money to lose its value and people to resort to bartering or a shadow currency. Germany in the early 1920s is a classic illustration of this. Unlike France and the United Kingdom, Germany financed World War I by printing more money. As a result, prices rose and the value of the mark plummeted, the German currency. However, as part of the post-war peace accord, it was had to pay a huge sum of additional money in reparations. The war had wreaked havoc on the economy, so it went to the printing presses once more. The task was made considerably more difficult because the reparations were in a foreign currency as well as gold, and the central bank had to print ever-increasing quantities of marks to buy back the same amount of debt. Prices in stores were raised many times a day at their height. 2. Cost-push inflation stagflation. Because demand pull inflation is easier to forecast, most experts concentrate on it. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, remarked economist Milton Friedman. Inflation can be induced by both changes in the cost base and increases in demand. Inflation like this is almost always negative since it boosts prices without increasing demand. Consumers must pay greater costs, but their earnings do not increase to compensate because businesses are also under pressure and are frequently looking to lay off employees. A supply-side shock is a term used to describe this situation. A large enough shock can result in stagflation, or significant inflation and unemployment. The Western economies in the 1970s are a classic example of this. In the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli War, Arab countries decided to raise oil prices first, then boycott the West, causing the price of oil to increase fourfold in less than a month. In 1975, inflation in the United Kingdom reached a high of 25%. Experts estimate that the increase cost the U.S. economy up to 8% of its GDP. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 resulted in a second significant increase in oil prices. Again, this had a significant impact on Western economies. In early 1981, yearly inflation in the United States surpassed 15%. During the same time span, unemployment rose to 7.6%. Inflation was brought down by a strong central bank strategy under Paul Volcker of raising interest rates well into double digits. It did so, however, at the cost of increasing unemployment, which peaked at 9.9%. Changes in the supply side, of course, are another approach to aid the economy in this regard. Cheap oil and commodity prices, combined with globalized labor keeping wages low, allowed nations to experience a combination of low inflation and good growth in the mid-1990s. Many people assumed that central banks had solved the problem of managing growth and inflation as a result of this. However, the truth was that they had simply been fortunate. What about deflation? So far, we've discussed rising prices. Deflation occurs when inflation is too low or even negative. The process of cost-push inflation reverses at this point. In this situation, demand is harmed by a decrease in the money supply or a reduction in government spending. Profits suffer as a result of fewer things being purchased. Because salaries are sticky on the downside, it's difficult to compel individuals to take pay cuts. Businesses instead cut output, which means they fire people and produce less. As a result, employment and economic growth are on the decline. Prices and salaries should, of course, eventually stabilize at lower levels. However, this process, which is frequently referred to as internal devaluation, can be lengthy and painful. Debtors are impacted by deflation in the same way that creditors are hit by unanticipated inflation, which reduces the value of their savings by driving up the real cost of servicing their debt. The Great Depression is the most famous example of a deflationary period. Between 1929 and 1933, the money supply in the United States declined by a quarter and prices plummeted by a third. During the 1920s, businesses and farms that took on a lot of debt found themselves unable to repay their creditors. This resulted in a wave of layoffs and bankruptcies, displacing millions of people. In 1933, unemployment reached a high of 25%. Government actions exacerbated the problem by relying on cartels to prop up prices and salaries rather than a meaningful monetary stimulus. The reduction in demand was accompanied by a supply-side shock. The U.S. economy did not fully recover until World War II supplied a stimulus, which is hardly the best approach to jumpstart your economy. The Japanese economy in the 1990s was another example. During the 1980s, a credit boom resulted in a property and stock market bubble. The government raised interest rates and tried to burst it. Deflation and increased unemployment resulted from the subsequent significant reduction in the money supply. It also left a massive quantity of bad debt in its wake. Although the money supply will eventually stabilize, it was insufficient to promote demand. As a result, prices either stayed the same or fell, implying that growth remained slow. Japan's lost decade has been labeled as a prolonged period of recession and stagnation.